In the year of our Lord 1095, as autumn leaves fell gently across the hills of France, Pope Urban II stood before a gathered multitude in the town of Clermont. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and as you settle deeper into comfort, imagine the hushed anticipation that filled that crowd. The Pope's voice carried across the assembly like a distant bell, speaking of sacred lands far to the east, of Christian pilgrims threatened on ancient roads, and of a call that would echo through the centuries. This moment, crystalline in its significance, marked the beginning of one of history's most complex and enduring sagas, the story of the Crusades. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos had sent envoys westward, their urgent messages carrying tales of Turkish advances and Christian suffering. These emissaries spoke of Constantinople's mighty walls and the emperor's desperate need for military aid. As the night deepens around you, picture these diplomatic journeys across medieval Europe, through forests and over mountain passes, carrying requests that would reshape the medieval world. The emperor's plea was not merely for soldiers, but for the salvation of Eastern Christianity itself. Urban's response transcended the original request. His words painted vivid images of Jerusalem, the holy city where Christ had walked, suffered, and risen. He spoke of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre defiled, of Christian pilgrims robbed and beaten on the roads to sacred sites. The Pope's rhetoric wove together spiritual salvation with temporal glory, promising those who took the cross both earthly adventure and heavenly reward. As you drift deeper into rest, consider how these words ignited imaginations across Western Europe, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest lord. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nobles and commoners alike began sewing crosses onto their garments, the symbol that would give these expeditions their name. The Latin cruciata, meaning marked with a cross, became the defining characteristic of these holy wars. In castle halls and village squares, in monasteries and marketplaces, the cry of Deus vult, God wills it, rang out like a prayer carried on the wind. The roots of this great movement stretch back centuries into the complex relationship between Christianity and Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad died in 632, his followers had burst forth from the Arabian Peninsula like a desert storm, conquering vast territories with remarkable speed. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and eventually Spain fell under Islamic rule. The Christian Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's Eastern legacy, found itself pressed on multiple fronts, its territories gradually diminishing under the weight of Islamic expansion. For centuries, an uneasy equilibrium had existed. Christian pilgrims could still visit Jerusalem, though they paid taxes and endured restrictions. Trade continued between Christian and Muslim lands, creating a web of economic interdependence. But the rise of the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century disrupted this balance. These nomadic warriors, newly converted to Islam, brought a militant energy to their conquests that alarmed both Byzantines and Western Christians. The Seljuks' victory over the Byzantine army at Manzikert in 1071 sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Emperor Romanos Diogenes was captured, and much of Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, fell under Turkish control. This defeat was not merely military, it was seen as a cosmic upheaval, a sign that perhaps God was testing Christian resolve. As you rest more deeply, imagine the weight of this moment, when an empire that had endured for 7 centuries suddenly seemed fragile and mortal. In the West, the Church had been undergoing its own transformation. The Gregorian Reform movement, named after Pope Gregory VII, sought to purify ecclesiastical life and assert papal authority over secular rulers. This religious revival created a climate ripe for holy war. The concept of justified violence in service of Christian goals had been developing for generations, influenced by Augustine's teachings on just war and the practical needs of defending Christian communities. The Peace of God movement had attempted to limit warfare's destructive effects, declaring certain times and places sacred and off-limits to violence. But the Crusades represented something different. Not the limitation of war, but its sanctification. Violence became not merely permissible, but holy when directed against the enemies of Christ. This theological revolution would have profound consequences, echoing through centuries of Christian thought and practice. When Urban called for the First Crusade, he unleashed forces that neither he nor anyone else could fully control. The first to respond were not the disciplined knights he had envisioned, but masses of common people, inspired by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit. This People's Crusade, or Peasants' Crusade, began in 1096, months before the official expeditions were ready to depart. Peter the Hermit, a small, swarthy man of extraordinary eloquence, travelled through France and Germany preaching the crusade with apocalyptic fervour. He spoke of visions and divine commands, of the urgent need to liberate Jerusalem before the end times. His followers included peasants, artisans, minor clergy, and some nobles. But many were simply poor people seeking escape from the hardships of medieval life. As the night continues to embrace you, picture these ragged processions moving eastward, singing hymns and carrying improvised banners, their faith their only armour. Tragically, this popular enthusiasm often turned violent against European Jewish communities. Crusaders, inflamed by religious rhetoric, and perhaps seeking to eliminate enemies closer to home before confronting those in distant lands, attacked Jewish settlements in the Rhineland and elsewhere. The massacres at Mainz, Worms, and Speyer marked the beginning of a dark pattern that would recur throughout the crusading era. These atrocities revealed how easily religious fervour could transform into persecution, and how the line between holy war abroad and violence at home could blur. The peasant armies that reached Constantinople in 1096 were ill-equipped and poorly organised. Emperor Alexios, alarmed by their numbers and behaviour, quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia. There, the Seljuk Turks, led by Kilij Arslan, destroyed them at Civitot in October 1096. Peter the Hermit survived, but most of his followers perished, their bones bleaching under the Anatolian sun. Their sacrifice became part of crusading legend, proof of the holy nature of the enterprise and the worthiness of their cause. Meanwhile, the main crusading armies were assembling. Unlike the People's Crusade, these were organised military expeditions led by some of Europe's most powerful nobles. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, sold his lands to finance his participation, demonstrating the enormous cost of crusading. His brothers Baldwin and Eustace joined him, creating a family enterprise that would shape the Crusades' early history. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, brought tactical brilliance and personal ambition to the enterprise. The Normans had already proven their military prowess in conquering England and establishing kingdoms in Sicily, and Bohemond saw the Crusade as an opportunity for further expansion. His rivalry with the Byzantine Empire added another layer of complexity to the expedition. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest nobles in Europe, led perhaps the largest contingent. His advanced age, he was in his 50s, elderly by medieval standards, and substantial resources made him a natural leader, though his imperious manner often created friction with other commanders. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the French king, brought royal prestige, if not overwhelming military strength. These armies converged on Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, creating a logistical nightmare for Emperor Alexios. The city, while magnificent, was not prepared to feed and house tens of thousands of Western warriors. Alexios, a skilled diplomat, managed to extract oaths of fealty from most leaders, securing their promise to return conquered territories to the empire. However, these oaths would prove a constant source of tension as the crusade progressed. The first major test came at Nicaea in May 1097. This heavily fortified city controlled the main route into Anatolia and had served as the Seljuk capital. The siege demonstrated both the Crusaders' military capabilities and the challenges they would face. Nicaea's walls, strengthened by generations of Muslim rulers, seemed impregnable. The Crusaders, lacking sophisticated siege equipment, had to improvise and adapt. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the patient work of that siege, the daily routine of camp life, the gradual tightening of the encirclement, the negotiations and small skirmishes that slowly wore down the defenders' resolve. The city's location beside Lake Iznik allowed it to receive supplies by water, forcing the Crusaders to find creative solutions. When Nicaea finally surrendered in June 1097, it was to Byzantine forces rather than the Crusaders, a diplomatic maneuver by Alexios that preserved the city but disappointed Western expectations of plunder. The march across Anatolia tested the Crusaders' endurance and unity. The Seljuk Turks, led by Kilij Arslan, had learned from their easy victory over the People's Crusade and now faced a more formidable enemy. At Dorylaeum in July 1097, the two armies met in a battle that would determine the Crusade's fate. The Turkish mounted archers, employing tactics perfected on the steppes of Central Asia, surrounded and harassed the Crusader vanguard, commanded by Bohemond. The battle seemed lost until the arrival of Crusader reinforcements transformed defeat into victory. The coordinated charge of heavy cavalry, a tactical innovation that had dominated European battlefields, proved effective against Turkish mobility. The victory at Dorylaeum opened the road to Syria and Palestine, but it also demonstrated the narrow margin between success and catastrophe that would characterize the entire crusading enterprise. The crossing of Anatolia became an epic of endurance. Summer heat, lack of water, and constant harassment by Turkish forces decimated the Crusader army. Horses died in such numbers that knights were forced to ride oxen or even dogs. The fertile valleys and ruined cities they passed told the story of Anatolia's decline under Turkish rule, reinforcing Crusader conviction that they were liberating ancient Christian lands. At Heraclea, the Crusader army divided. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, struck eastward toward Edessa with a small force, demonstrating the opportunistic nature of many Crusaders. Baldwin's detour would establish the first Crusader state, but it also weakened the main army and revealed the competing priorities that would eventually fragment the movement. The Siege of Antioch, beginning in October 1097, became the Crusades' defining ordeal. This ancient city, where followers of Christ were first called Christians, controlled the route to Jerusalem and boasted formidable defenses. The siege lasted 8 months, testing Crusader resolve through a winter of starvation, disease, and despair. As you rest more deeply, picture the gradual transformation of the besiegers into the besieged, as Muslim relief armies arrived to trap the Crusaders between Antioch's walls and surrounding forces. The discovery of the Holy Lance in June 1098 marked a turning point. Peter Bartholomew, a peasant in Raymond of Toulouse's contingent, claimed to have found the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. Hidden beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral, the relic provided divine validation for the crusade at its darkest moment. Whether authentic or fabricated, the lance's discovery galvanized Crusader morale and prepared them for the final assault that would capture the city. Bohemon's betrayal of his oath to Alexios became apparent when he claimed Antioch for himself rather than returning it to the Byzantine Empire. This decision established the Principality of Antioch as an independent Crusader state and created lasting bitterness between Byzantines and Western Crusaders. The pattern of opportunism overriding religious purpose would repeat throughout crusading history. The final approach to Jerusalem in 1099 carried apocalyptic significance. Crusaders believed they were participating in events foretold in biblical prophecy, that their capture of the holy city would herald Christ's return and the end of earthly time. The sight of Jerusalem's walls, golden in the Middle Eastern sun, moved hardened warriors to tears. Many walked barefoot around the city, following biblical precedent and demonstrating their penitential devotion. The siege of Jerusalem lasted only 5 weeks, but those weeks compressed centuries of Christian longing and Muslim resistance into a few crucial days. The city's Fatimid garrison, recently arrived from Egypt, fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender meant death or slavery. The Crusaders, reduced to perhaps 15,000 effective fighters, faced the challenge of their lives against the walls that had protected Jerusalem for millennia. Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower, constructed from timber blessed by priests and financed by the last of the Crusaders' resources, provided the key to victory. On July 15th, 1099, as the night deepens around you, imagine the moment when Crusader feet first touch Jerusalem's ramparts, when the impossible dream of 3 years became reality. The capture of Jerusalem marked not an end, but a beginning, the birth of the Crusader states, and the transformation of the Holy Land into a theatre of perpetual conflict. The massacre that followed Jerusalem's capture revealed the dark side of crusading enthusiasm. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood, the slaughter of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, and the burning of synagogues with their congregations trapped inside. This violence, while not unprecedented in medieval warfare, was particularly shocking because of its religious context and the Crusaders' claims to divine mandate. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under Godfrey of Bouillon created a unique political entity. Godfrey, refusing the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, became defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His decision reflected the complex relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that characterized the Crusader states. When Godfrey died in 1100, his brother Baldwin accepted the royal title, establishing a dynasty that would rule Jerusalem for nearly a century. The Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and later Tripoli, represented a remarkable experiment in medieval colonization. These narrow strips of territory, stretching along the eastern Mediterranean coast and reaching inland to control key trade routes, were defended by a combination of military orders, feudal levies, and local allies. The state's survival depended on maintaining favorable balances of power among their Muslim neighbors and receiving periodic reinforcement from Europe. The military orders that emerged from this environment created a new model of Christian warfare. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, combined monastic vows with military service. These warrior monks, dressed in white mantles marked with red crosses, became the shock troops of the Crusader states. Their wealth, derived from donations and banking activities, made them a power unto themselves. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to care for sick pilgrims, evolved into another military order with extensive holdings throughout the Crusader states and Europe. Later, the Teutonic Knights would apply similar principles to campaigns in the Baltic, demonstrating how crusading ideals could be adapted to different contexts. These orders represented the institutionalization of holy war, creating permanent military forces dedicated to Christian expansion and defense. As you drift deeper into restful sleep, consider the daily life of the Crusader states during their golden age in the early 12th century. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, centered on the Holy City itself, developed a sophisticated feudal structure adapted to Middle Eastern conditions. Noble families like the Ibelines and Courtenays established dynasties that would endure for generations, intermarrying with local Christian populations and creating a unique Franco-Syrian culture. The architecture of the Crusader states reflected this cultural synthesis. Churches built in Romanesque and early Gothic styles incorporated Middle Eastern techniques and materials. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was extensively rebuilt, creating an architectural masterpiece that combined Western engineering with Eastern aesthetics. Castles like Crac de Chevalier in Syria represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture, their massive walls and sophisticated defenses adapted to the specialized needs of frontier warfare. Trade flourished under Crusader rule as European merchants established permanent colonies in cities like Acre and Tyre. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, gained commercial privileges in exchange for naval support, creating a network of trading posts that connected Europe with Asian markets. This commercial activity brought wealth to the Crusader states, but also created dependencies that would prove problematic as their military situation deteriorated. The native Christian populations of the region, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Armenian, and others, found themselves in a complex position under Crusader rule. While relieved to be free from Muslim taxation and restrictions, they often faced pressure to conform to Roman Catholic practices. The Crusader states' religious diversity became both a strength and a source of internal tension, as different Christian communities competed for influence and resources. The second generation of Crusader rulers, born in the Holy Land, developed a more nuanced understanding of regional politics than their fathers. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, Godfrey's cousin and successor, proved particularly adept at playing Muslim factions against each other. His marriage alliances and diplomatic initiatives created a web of relationships that extended Crusader influence far beyond their actual military strength. The Principality of Antioch, under Bohemond's successors, became a center of cultural and intellectual exchange. The city's strategic location made it a crossroads where Greek, Armenian, Arab, and Western traditions intersected. Antioch's court attracted scholars, artists, and adventurers from across the Mediterranean world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the frontier conditions of more remote Crusader settlements. The county of Edessa, established by Baldwin of Boulogne before he became King of Jerusalem, represented the most exposed of the Crusader states. Located across the Euphrates River in largely Armenian territory, Edessa depended on the goodwill of local Christian populations and the division of its Muslim neighbors. Baldwin's marriage to an Armenian princess demonstrated the pragmatic approach necessary for survival in this challenging environment. The fall of Edessa in 1144 to the Muslim general Zengi marked the beginning of the Crusader states' long decline. Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, represented a new type of Muslim leader, one capable of uniting previously fragmented forces under the banner of jihad. His capture of Edessa sent shockwaves through the Christian world and prompted calls for a new crusade to restore the situation. The Second Crusade, preached by Bernard of Clairvaux and led by King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, demonstrated both the continued appeal of crusading and its inherent limitations. Bernard, the most influential religious figure of his age, brought moral authority to the enterprise, but his lack of military experience and the competing priorities of temporal rulers complicated the expedition from its inception. The German army's destruction in Anatolia revealed the continuing dangers of the overland route to the Holy Land. Conrad's forces, following the same path as the First Crusade 50 years earlier, found the region more hostile and less hospitable than their predecessors had. Turkish tactics had evolved to counter Crusader heavy cavalry, and local populations had learned to avoid involvement in Christian-Muslim conflicts. Louis VII's army, travelling separately from the Germans, survived the journey to Antioch but arrived depleted and demoralised. The French king's relationship with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, became strained during the campaign, leading to personal conflicts that would have profound political consequences. Eleanor's alleged affair with Raymond of Antioch, her uncle, created scandals that weakened French commitment to the Crusade. The decision to attack Damascus in 1148 revealed the strategic confusion that plagued the Second Crusade. Damascus, under the rule of Unur, had been a potential ally against Zengi and his successors. The Crusader assault on this city drove its ruler into alliance with Nur ad-Din, Zengi's son, strengthening Muslim unity rather than restoring Christian fortunes. The siege's failure after only 4 days marked the effective end of the Second Crusade and established a pattern of strategic miscalculation that would characterize later expeditions. Nur ad-Din's rise to power following his father's assassination in 1146 represented a new phase in Muslim response to the Crusades. Unlike earlier Muslim rulers, who had often been content to coexist with the Crusader states while pursuing their own dynastic interests, Nur ad-Din embraced jihad as both religious duty and political strategy. His court in Damascus became a center of Islamic learning and propaganda, attracting scholars and warriors committed to expelling the Crusaders from Muslim lands. The concept of jihad, while present in Islamic thought from the beginning, took on new urgency and coherence under Nur ad-Din's patronage. Religious scholars developed sophisticated justifications for holy war, drawing on Quranic texts and prophetic traditions to create a theological framework for sustained military action. This intellectual movement paralleled similar developments in Christian thought about crusading, creating rival ideologies of sacred violence that would fuel conflict for generations. As the night continues to enfold you in its peaceful embrace, consider the gradual shift in momentum that characterized the mid-12th century. The Crusader states, initially benefiting from Muslim disunity and their own military advantages, found themselves increasingly pressed by a more organized and ideologically committed enemy. The balance of power, which had favored the Christians for the first half-century after the First Crusade, began to tip toward Muslim forces with superior numbers and resources. Nur ad-Din's alliance with the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt created a strategic nightmare for the Crusaders. The possibility of coordinated attacks from both north and south threatened to crush the Crusader states between converging Muslim armies. King Amalric of Jerusalem's repeated campaigns in Egypt represented desperate attempts to prevent this alliance from becoming effective. But his limited resources and the complexity of Egyptian politics frustrated these efforts. The rise of Saladin in Egypt marked the emergence of the greatest Muslim leader of the crusading era. Born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in Kurdish Iraq, Saladin came to Egypt as a subordinate of Nur ad-Din, but gradually established his independence. His overthrow of the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171 united Egypt under Sunni rule for the first time in 2 centuries, creating a power base that would enable him to challenge Crusader dominance. Saladin's character combined military brilliance with political cunning and religious devotion. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he managed to balance the competing demands of holy war and pragmatic statecraft. His reputation for chivalry and mercy, while sometimes exaggerated by later chroniclers, reflected genuine aspects of his personality that distinguished him from more brutal rulers of his era. The unification of Egypt and Syria under Saladin's rule in the 1170s created the strategic situation that Crusader leaders had long dreaded. For the first time since the Crusades began, a single Muslim ruler controlled the resources necessary to mount sustained campaigns against all the Crusader states simultaneously. Saladin's careful diplomacy and gradual territorial expansion revealed a patient and methodical approach to the problem of Christian occupation. The internal divisions that weakened the Crusader states during this critical period reflected both the inherent instability of feudal institutions and the specific challenges of frontier society. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's succession crisis following the death of King Amalric in 1174 created opportunities for factional conflict that Saladin was quick to exploit. The regencies required by Baldwin IV's youth and leprosy, followed by the disputed succession of Baldwin V, paralysed Christian decision-making at crucial moments. The rise of Reynaud of Chatillon as a major figure in Crusader politics demonstrated how individual ambition could undermine collective security. Reynaud's raids on Muslim pilgrimage caravans and his provocative attacks on Arabian ports violated truces and provided Saladin with pretexts for renewed warfare. His capture of a caravan containing Saladin's sister made personal what had previously been merely political, ensuring that the Muslim leader would seek not just military victory, but personal revenge. The Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, represented the culmination of decades of political and military development. Saladin's careful planning had created the perfect trap, luring the entire Crusader army into the waterless hills between Tiberias and Hattin, where heat, thirst, and tactical disadvantage combined to ensure Christian defeat. As you rest more deeply, imagine the dust and heat of that July day, the desperate thirst of armored men under the blazing sun, and the gradual realization that centuries of Christian dominance in the Holy Land were ending. The capture of the True Cross at Hattin carried symbolic significance that transcended mere military victory. This relic, believed to be wood from Christ's crucifixion, had served as a talisman for Crusader armies since the conquest of Jerusalem. Its loss to Muslim forces seemed to many Christians a sign of divine displeasure, evidence that their sins had cost them God's favor. The psychological impact of this loss may have been even greater than the military catastrophe that accompanied it. King Guy of Lusignan's capture at Hattin effectively eliminated organized resistance to Saladin's subsequent campaigns. The Muslim leader's systematic reduction of Crusader strongholds throughout the summer and fall of 1187 demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his recognition that military success must be consolidated through political control. City after city surrendered with minimal resistance, their defenders killed or captured at Hattin. The siege of Jerusalem in September 1187 lasted only 12 days but carried enormous symbolic weight. Saladin's approach to the Holy City was carefully orchestrated to emphasize both his power and his mercy. Unlike the Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the Muslim reconquest was marked by relative restraint and respect for Christian lives and property. This restraint, while genuine, also served propaganda purposes, demonstrating Islamic justice and contrasting with Christian brutality. The negotiated surrender of Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, marked the end of the first phase of Crusader occupation. Balian of Ibelin, defending the city in the name of Queen Sibylla, secured terms that allowed Christian inhabitants to purchase their freedom rather than face slavery. Those who could not pay were enslaved, but the overall conduct of the conquest reinforced Saladin's reputation for chivalry and provided a model for honorable warfare that would influence military ethics for centuries. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in late 1187, creating a crisis of faith and calls for immediate action. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the news, while his successor, Gregory VIII, immediately proclaimed a new crusade. The loss of the Holy City seemed to many Christians an event of apocalyptic significance, requiring the most extreme measures to restore God's favor and Christian honor. The Third Crusade, launched in response to these disasters, attracted the most impressive array of royal participants in crusading history. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, King Philip Augustus of France, and King Richard III of England all took the cross, creating expectations of swift and decisive victory. The participation of these three monarchs seemed to guarantee success, but their competing interests and conflicting personalities would complicate the expedition from the beginning. Frederick Barbarossa's death by drowning in the Salef River in June 1190 deprived the Third Crusade of its most experienced commander and eliminated the largest contingent of soldiers. The German emperor, nearly 70 years old but still vigorous, had successfully navigated the treacherous overland route through the Byzantine Empire and Anatolia, only to perish in a minor river crossing. His death scattered his army and created a leadership vacuum that the remaining commanders struggled to fill. The rivalry between Philip Augustus and Richard III reflected broader tensions between the Capetian and Plantagenet dynasties that would dominate medieval European politics. Their cooperation in the Third Crusade was superficial, undermined by territorial disputes and personal animosity. Philip's early departure from the Holy Land after the capture of Acre demonstrated how secular concerns could override religious commitments, even in the most sacred of enterprises. Richard I's reputation as a military commander was established during the Third Crusade through a series of brilliant tactical victories. His defeat of Saladin at Arsuf in September 1191 demonstrated that Muslim forces were not invincible and restored Christian confidence. The English king's understanding of siege warfare and his ability to coordinate complex military operations made him the most effective Crusader commander since Bohemond of Taranto. The Siege of Acre, which lasted from 1189 to 1191, became a symbol of Crusader determination and Muslim resistance. The city's strategic location and powerful fortifications made it the key to any Christian attempt to re-establish a foothold in the Holy Land. The siege's duration and cost, both sides lost thousands of men to disease and combat, demonstrated the new realities of warfare in the age of Saladin. Richard's massacre of Muslim prisoners after Acre's capture revealed the brutal realities that coexisted with chivalric ideals. The execution of nearly 3,000 captives was justified by military necessity, Saladin's delays in implementing the surrender terms, but it also reflected the limits of medieval mercy. This act, while shocking by modern standards, was consistent with contemporary practices and demonstrated how quickly noble intentions could give way to practical considerations. The march from Acre to Jaffa showcased Richard's tactical genius and his army's discipline. Moving slowly along the coast while maintaining defensive formations, the Crusaders neutralized Saladin's advantages in mobility and numbers. The successful completion of this march, despite constant harassment and the challenges of maintaining supplies, proved that determined Christian forces could still operate effectively in the Holy Land. As you drift deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the negotiation of the Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192, which ended the Third Crusade. Richard and Saladin, despite never meeting face to face, developed a mutual respect that transcended their religious differences. The treaty's terms, Christian control of the coast from Tyre to Jaffa, Muslim control of the interior including Jerusalem, and guaranteed access for Christian pilgrims, reflected the military stalemate that had developed over 3 years of campaigning. The Third Crusade's conclusion without the reconquest of Jerusalem marked a turning point in crusading history. For the first time, a major expedition had failed to achieve its primary objective, despite significant military successes. This failure forced Christians to reconsider their assumptions about divine favor and military capability, leading to new approaches to the problem of the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade, proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in 1298, demonstrated how crusading could be diverted from its original purposes by secular interests and practical necessities. The decision to attack Constantinople rather than Egypt or the Holy Land represented a fundamental betrayal of crusading ideals, but it also reflected the complex political and economic realities that shaped medieval warfare. The Crusaders' contract with Venice for transport to the Holy Land created dependencies that Doge Enrico Dandolo skillfully exploited to serve Venetian commercial interests. The attack on Zara in 1202, undertaken to pay Venice for shipping, marked the first time a crusading army had attacked a Christian city. This precedent made subsequent diversions easier to justify and demonstrated how financial considerations could override religious scruples. The siege and capture of Constantinople in 1204 represented one of the most shocking events in medieval history. The Crusaders' assault on the greatest Christian city in the world, their looting of churches and holy relics, and their establishment of a Latin empire in place of the Byzantine Empire permanently altered the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Fourth Crusade's legacy poisoned relations between Eastern and Western Christianity for centuries. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, established by Crusader nobles under Baldwin of Flanders, proved to be a weak and transitory creation. Lacking the administrative sophistication and cultural legitimacy of the Byzantine Empire it replaced, the Latin Empire struggled to control even the territories immediately surrounding Constantinople. Its existence further weakened Christian resistance to Muslim expansion and created new opportunities for Islamic advance. The Children's Crusade of 1212, while possibly legendary in its traditional form, reflected the continued appeal of crusading ideals to all levels of society. Stories of children marching to the Holy Land, convinced that their innocence would succeed where armed force had failed, demonstrated both the movement's continued vitality and its increasing disconnection from military and political reality. These tales, whether historical or mythical, captured the tragic idealism that characterized much of later crusading history. The Fifth Crusade, directed against Egypt, represented a return to strategic thinking after the disasters of the Fourth Crusade. The decision to attack the Ayyubid Empire's economic and political center, rather than attempting direct assault on the Holy Land, reflected sophisticated military planning. The Crusaders' initial success in capturing Damietta in 1219 seemed to validate this approach and raised hopes for decisive victory. The leadership of Cardinal Pelagius during the Fifth Crusade illustrated the growing role of papal legates in directing crusading expeditions. Pelagius's rejection of advantageous peace terms offered by Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, demonstrated how religious inflexibility could undermine military success. The cardinal's insistence on total victory rather than negotiated settlement ultimately led to the Crusades' failure and the loss of Damietta. Francis of Assisi's mission to Sultan al-Kamil during the Fifth Crusade represented a different approach to Christian-Muslim relations. The future saint's peaceful attempt to convert the Sultan through preaching, rather than warfare, offered an alternative to the violence that had characterized centuries of Christian-Muslim interaction. While unsuccessful in its immediate aims, Francis's mission demonstrated that not all Christians accepted the necessity of holy war. The Sixth Crusade, led by Emperor Frederick II, achieved the remarkable feat of regaining Jerusalem through negotiation rather than warfare. Frederick's excommunication by Pope Gregory IX created the anomaly of an excommunicated emperor leading a crusade, but his diplomatic skills and knowledge of Arabic culture enabled him to secure terms that military force had not achieved. The treaty signed in 1229 returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control for 15 years. Frederick II's coronation as King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, performed by himself due to his excommunication, symbolized the complex relationship between secular and religious authority in the later Crusades. The emperor's success through diplomacy rather than warfare challenged traditional assumptions about the necessity of violence in achieving Christian goals and demonstrated the potential for peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims. The Barons' Crusade of 1239 to 1241, led by Thibault of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall, represented the final successful attempt to expand Christian territory in the Holy Land through negotiation. The complex diplomatic arrangements that returned most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to Christian control reflected the sophisticated understanding of regional politics that had developed among both Christians and Muslims after decades of conflict. As the night deepens around you, consider the gradual erosion of the Crusader states during the 13th century, despite these temporary successes. The Ayyubid Empire's fragmentation after Al-Kamil's death in 1238 created opportunities for Christian expansion, but it also enabled the rise of the Mamluks in Egypt, who would prove to be more formidable enemies than their predecessors. The Mamluks, originally slave soldiers trained for warfare, combined military effectiveness with ideological commitment to jihad. The Mongol invasions of the 1240s and 1250s created a new element in Middle Eastern politics that temporarily overshadowed Christian-Muslim conflict. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 by Hulagu Khan's forces eliminated the Abbasid Caliphate and fundamentally altered the Islamic world's political structure. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Mongols might become allies of the Crusader states, as many Mongol leaders were Christian or sympathetic to Christianity. The Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where Mamluk forces defeated the Mongols, established the Mamluks as the dominant power in the region and sealed the fate of the remaining Crusader states. Sultan Baybars, who came to power after this victory, proved to be the most effective Muslim opponent the Crusaders had faced since Saladin. Unlike Saladin, however, Baibars showed little interest in chivalric conduct or diplomatic solutions, preferring systematic warfare aimed at complete Christian expulsion. Baibars' capture of Antioch in 1268 marked the beginning of the final phase of Crusader decline. The fall of this ancient city, which had resisted Muslim conquest for 171 years, sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Baibars' treatment of Antioch's population, massacre, slavery, and destruction demonstrated his commitment to eliminating Christian presence rather than merely defeating Christian armies. The city's magnificent cathedral was converted into a mosque, symbolizing the permanence of Muslim reconquest. The Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis, represented the last major attempt by a Western monarch to restore Christian fortunes in the Holy Land. Louis's invasion of Egypt in 1248 initially succeeded in capturing Damietta, but the advance toward Cairo became bogged down in the Nile Delta's difficult terrain. The king's capture at the Battle of Farisker in 1250 effectively ended the expedition and demonstrated the growing obsolescence of traditional crusading methods. Louis IX's second expedition to the Mediterranean in 1270, directed against Tunis rather than the Holy Land, revealed how crusading had become entangled with other political objectives. The French king's death from disease at Tunis ended the last crusade, led by a canonized saint, and marked the effective conclusion of royal participation in the movement. Later expeditions would be led by lesser nobles or coordinated by the military orders, lacking the prestige and resources that royal leadership had provided. The decline of the Crusader states accelerated during the 2270s and 2280s as Mamluk pressure intensified and European support diminished. The fall of the Crac des Chevaliers in 1271, after a siege of only 6 weeks, eliminated one of the strongest Crusader fortifications and demonstrated the Mamluks' growing expertise in siege warfare. The great castle's surrender marked the end of effective Crusader resistance in the interior and confined Christian forces to coastal strongholds. The internal politics of the remnant Kingdom of Jerusalem became increasingly complex as the realm's territorial base contracted. The rivalry between the Venetians and Genoese, played out in the streets of Acre and other coastal cities, weakened Christian unity at a crucial moment. The War of San Sabas, fought between these Italian maritime republics from 1256 to 1270, diverted resources and attention from the Muslim threat and demonstrated how commercial interest could override religious solidarity. Edward I of England's Crusade in 1271 to 1272, undertaken while he was still heir to the throne, represented the last significant Western attempt to reinforce the Crusader states. Edward's small force achieved little beyond demonstrating continued English commitment to the crusading ideal. The future king's narrow escape from an assassin's attack in Acre became part of crusading legend, but his expedition's limited scope revealed the movement's declining appeal to European nobility. The military order's role in defending the Crusader states became increasingly crucial as secular support diminished. The Templars and Hospitallers, with their extensive European holdings and dedicated military forces, represented the most reliable defenders of Christian territory. However, their rivalry with each other and with secular authorities sometimes undermined their effectiveness. The order's wealth and independence also made them targets of suspicion and envy in both East and West. As you rest deeper into the peaceful night, consider the daily life of the Crusader states during their final decades. The remaining Christian territories had developed a unique culture that blended Western and Eastern elements, creating art, architecture, and literature that reflected centuries of cultural exchange. The castles and churches of this period, while often built under the shadow of military necessity, demonstrated remarkable artistic achievement and technical sophistication. The native Christian communities of the region, the so-called Polani, who had been born in Crusader territory, developed their own identity distinct from both Western Europeans and local Muslims. These communities, often multilingual and culturally sophisticated, served as intermediaries between different religious and ethnic groups. Their loyalty to the Crusader states, while sometimes questioned by Western newcomers, proved generally reliable throughout the period of Christian rule. Trade continued to flourish in the coastal cities despite the military pressures that surrounded them. Acre, in particular, became a cosmopolitan center where merchants from across the Mediterranean world conducted business under the protection of various Christian and Muslim authorities. The city's famous markets, described by contemporary travelers, offered goods from as far away as India and Central Asia, demonstrating the commercial networks that connected the Crusader states to the broader medieval economy. The fall of Tripoli in 1289 to Sultan Qalawun marked the beginning of the final crisis for the Crusader states. This city, which had been under Christian rule since 1109, had served as a crucial link between the northern and southern portions of the Crusader territories. Its loss isolated Acre and the remaining Christian strongholds, making coordinated defense impossible and encouraging local Muslim leaders to join the Mamluk offensive. The siege of Acre in 1291 represented the final act of the Crusader drama in the Holy Land. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, Qalawun's son, assembled the largest Muslim army yet seen against a Christian target, including massive siege engines and specialized troops trained in urban warfare. The city's defenders, a mixture of military orders, Italian merchants, and local militia, fought with desperate courage but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and resources. The heroic defense of Acre by the Grand Master of the Templars, William of Beaujeu, became legendary in crusading literature. His death during the final assault symbolized the end of an era and the failure of 2 centuries of Christian effort to maintain a permanent presence in the Holy Land. The Grand Master's sacrifice, along with those of hundreds of other defenders, entered crusading mythology as evidence of Christian valor in the face of inevitable defeat. The evacuation of Acre's civilian population during the siege's final days created scenes of tragedy and heroism that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. Ships from Venice, Genoa, and other Christian ports carried away thousands of refugees, but many others were killed or enslaved when the city finally fell on May 18, 1291. The Mamluks' systematic destruction of Acre's fortifications and harbour facilities ensured that the city would not serve as a base for future Christian expeditions. The fall of the remaining Crusader strongholds during the summer of 1291 proceeded with almost mechanical efficiency. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and other coastal cities surrendered or were evacuated without significant resistance, their garrisons recognizing the futility of further defense. By August 1291, no Christian territory remained under Crusader control in the Levant, ending nearly 2 centuries of Western presence in the Holy Land. The immediate aftermath of the Crusader states' collapse saw various attempts to organize new expeditions for their recovery. Pope Nicholas IV called for a new crusade immediately after receiving news of Acre's fall and various European nobles pledged their support. However, the political situation in Europe, ongoing conflicts between England and France, the crisis of papal authority, and the rise of strong national monarchies made large-scale cooperation increasingly difficult. The Templars' suppression between 1307 and 1314 eliminated one of the most powerful institutions associated with the crusading movement. King Philip IV of France's accusations against the order, heresy, sodomy, and idol worship may have been motivated primarily by financial considerations, but they also reflected changing attitudes toward the military orders. The Templars' wealth and secrecy had made them objects of suspicion, and their failure to prevent the loss of the Holy Land undermined their credibility. The trial and execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, in 1314 marked a symbolic end to the classical crusading era. De Molay's defiant speech from the stake, in which he allegedly cursed King Philip and Pope Clement V, became part of popular legend and demonstrated the enduring power of crusading ideals, even in defeat. The Grand Master's martyrdom transformed him from a failed military leader into a symbol of noble resistance to temporal authority. The Hospitallers' retreat to Rhodes in 1309 represented an attempt to continue the crusading tradition in a new form. The Order's conquest of this strategic island and their subsequent naval campaigns against Muslim shipping demonstrated the adaptability of crusading institutions. Rhodes became a Christian outpost in the Eastern Mediterranean, maintaining the ideal of holy war even after the loss of the Holy Land itself. The concept of crusade underwent significant evolution during the 14th and 15th centuries as the movement adapted to new circumstances. The Iberian Reconquista, the campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, and the Crusades against heretical movements in Europe all drew on crusading ideology while addressing different political and military realities. These diverse applications of crusading principles demonstrated both the movement's flexibility and its gradual transformation from a specific response to Muslim control of the Holy Land into a general tool of papal and royal policy. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century created new opportunities for crusading activity while also revealing the movement's limitations. The Ottomans' expansion into the Balkans and their threat to Constantinople prompted various Christian rulers to organize expeditions under the crusading banner. However, these campaigns often suffered from the same problems that had plagued earlier crusades: inadequate coordination, competing objectives, and insufficient resources. The Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, led by King Sigismund of Hungary, demonstrated both the continued appeal of crusading ideals and the military realities of the late medieval period. The expedition attracted nobles from across Europe, including French, English, and German knights seeking to win glory against the infidel. However, their defeat at Nicopolis by Sultan Bayezid I revealed the tactical obsolescence of traditional crusading methods when confronted by disciplined Ottoman forces. As you drift deeper into restful sleep, imagine the literary and cultural legacy that emerged from the crusading experience. The chansons de geste, romance literature, and historical chronicles that recounted crusading deeds created a body of literature that shaped European imagination for centuries. Works like the Chanson d'Antioche and the Chronicles of William of Tyre transformed military expeditions into epic narratives of Christian heroism and divine providence. The development of chivalric ideals was profoundly influenced by crusading experience, creating codes of conduct that emphasized honor, courtesy, and service to God and lady. The literary figure of the Crusader knight, exemplified by characters like Godfrey of Bouillon in the medieval epics, became a model for aristocratic behavior that influenced European culture long after the last crusade had ended. These ideals, while often honored more in literature than in practice, provided a framework for understanding noble duty and Christian obligation. The architectural legacy of the Crusades left permanent marks on both Eastern and Western landscapes. The great Crusader castles, Crac des Chevaliers, Margat, Belvoir, represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture and influenced fortification design throughout Europe. Churches built in the Crusader states, combining Western and Eastern architectural traditions, created new artistic syntheses that enriched both Christian and Islamic cultures. The economic impact of the Crusades on European development was profound and lasting. The movement stimulated trade between East and West, encouraged the development of banking and credit systems, and promoted technological exchange between different civilizations. Italian maritime republics, in particular, benefited enormously from crusading commerce, using their profits to finance the cultural achievements of the Renaissance. The Crusades' influence on the development of European monarchies and national identities was equally significant. The movement provided opportunities for royal leadership and international cooperation, while also creating financial burdens that strengthened royal taxation systems. The experience of organizing large-scale military expeditions contributed to the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions and administrative practices. The impact on Islamic civilization was equally complex and enduring. The Crusades prompted the development of jihad ideology as a systematic response to Christian aggression, while also encouraging the military and technological innovations that eventually enabled Muslim victory. The experience of confronting Western military techniques and political institutions influenced Islamic military practice and diplomatic methods. The figure of Saladin became central to both Christian and Muslim understanding of ideal leadership, representing the possibility of honor and nobility, even in warfare between different religious communities. His reputation for justice and mercy, while sometimes exaggerated, provided a model for conduct that influenced both Christian and Islamic concepts of proper rule. The legendary status accorded to Saladin in European literature demonstrated the grudging respect that emerged between opponents after centuries of conflict. The memory of the Crusades in both Christian and Islamic cultures became deeply embedded in religious and national consciousness, influencing attitudes toward interfaith relations for centuries. In Christian Europe, the movement was remembered as a noble but tragic enterprise, a testament to medieval faith and courage that had ultimately failed due to human sinfulness and divine judgment. This memory influenced European attitudes towards the Islamic world and provided justification for later imperial ventures. In the Islamic world, the Crusades were remembered as a period of foreign invasion successfully repelled through unity and faith. The memory of Crusader occupation provided a framework for understanding later European colonialism and continues to influence contemporary political discourse. The successful Muslim response to the Crusades became a source of pride and inspiration for later generations facing Western pressure. The scholarly study of the Crusades, beginning in the 19th century, reflected the political and cultural concerns of different periods. European scholars initially emphasized the movement's role in promoting Western civilization and Christian values, while later historians have adopted more critical perspectives that examine the Crusades' destructive effects and their role in promoting religious intolerance. Contemporary scholarship increasingly attempts to understand the movement from multiple perspectives, including those of Byzantine, Islamic, and Eastern Christian participants. The ongoing political relevance of crusading imagery and rhetoric in contemporary conflicts demonstrates the movement's enduring symbolic power. References to crusades and jihad continue to appear in political discourse, often divorced from historical context, but retaining emotional resonance. This persistent relevance reflects the fundamental questions about religious identity, cultural conflict, and the relationship between faith and violence that the Crusades raised, but never fully resolved. The archaeological investigation of Crusader sites has revealed the complex reality of daily life in the Crusader states, challenging romanticized literary portrayals while confirming the remarkable cultural synthesis that developed in these frontier societies. Excavations at sites like Caesarea, Acre, and various Crusader castles have uncovered evidence of technological innovation, artistic achievement, and peaceful coexistence, alongside the military artifacts that dominate popular imagination. The study of Crusader art and architecture has revealed sophisticated cultural exchange between Christian and Islamic traditions. The development of distinctive Crusader architectural styles, incorporating Western structural techniques with Eastern decorative traditions, created buildings of remarkable beauty and functionality. The survival of these structures, despite centuries of warfare and neglect, testifies to the skill of their builders and the cultural achievement they represent. The preservation of Crusader manuscripts and documents has enabled modern scholars to reconstruct the complex administrative and legal systems that governed the Crusader states. These sources reveal sophisticated approaches to governing diverse populations, managing commercial relationships, and maintaining military forces under challenging conditions. The legal codes developed in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in particular, influenced legal development throughout the medieval Mediterranean world. The demographic impact of the Crusades on both European and Middle Eastern populations remains a subject of scholarly debate. While the movement certainly resulted in significant population movements and cultural exchange, the extent of permanent settlement and long-term demographic change is difficult to determine from available sources. What is clear is that the Crusades created networks of relationship and exchange that persisted long after the military expeditions had ended. The role of women in the crusading movement, while often overlooked in traditional accounts, was significant and complex. Noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Melisende of Jerusalem, and Countess Alice of Antioch played crucial roles in crusade organization, financing, and governance. The experience of crusading also created new opportunities and challenges for women of all social classes, from the queens who ruled Crusader states to the humble pilgrims who joined popular expeditions. The religious impact of the Crusades on Christian theology and practice was profound and lasting. The movement prompted the development of new justifications for Christian warfare, influenced the evolution of concepts of martyrdom and holy war, and affected the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The Crusades also encouraged the development of new forms of popular piety and devotional practice, particularly devotion to the Holy Land and its sacred sites. The technological exchange promoted by the Crusades influenced military, architectural, and scientific development in both Christian and Islamic civilizations. The encounter between different military traditions led to innovations in fortification design, siege warfare, and cavalry tactics. The cultural exchange facilitated by trade and diplomacy also promoted the transmission of scientific and philosophical knowledge between East and West. As the night continues to embrace you in its peaceful depths, consider the complex legacy of the crusading movement as it evolved beyond its original focus on the Holy Land. The Northern Crusades against the pagan peoples of the Baltic region represented a different application of crusading ideology, one that was ultimately more successful in achieving its stated objectives. The conquest and conversion of Prussia, Livonia, and Lithuania extended Christian territory and created new Christian kingdoms that would endure for centuries. The Teutonic Knights' role in the Northern Crusades demonstrated how military orders could adapt to different circumstances while maintaining their fundamental character. The order's systematic approach to conquest, colonization, and conversion in the Baltic created a model for Christian expansion that influenced later European colonial ventures. The Teutonic state in Prussia became one of medieval Europe's most efficiently organized territories, demonstrating the potential for crusading institutions to create lasting political achievements. The Hussite Wars of the early 15th century revealed how crusading ideology could be applied to internal Christian conflicts. The expeditions against the followers of Jan Hus in Bohemia were proclaimed as Crusades against heresy, offering the same spiritual benefits as expeditions to the Holy Land. These campaigns demonstrated both the flexibility of crusading concepts and their potential for abuse when applied to suppress theological dissent. The final transformation of crusading ideology occurred with the Ottoman expansion into Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 prompted calls for new crusades to liberate the former Byzantine capital, while Ottoman advances into Hungary and toward Vienna created genuine existential threats to Christian Europe. These campaigns, while bearing the crusading name, were increasingly motivated by political and strategic rather than purely religious considerations. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, fought between the Holy League and the Ottoman Empire, represented the last great military victory achieved under the crusading banner. Don John of Austria's defeat of the Ottoman fleet was celebrated throughout Christian Europe as a triumph of faith over infidelity. But the battle's strategic significance was limited. The Ottoman Empire's continued expansion demonstrated that military victory alone could not reverse the fundamental shift in power that had occurred since the medieval period. The gradual decline of crusading ideology during the 16th and 17th centuries reflected broader changes in European religious and political culture. The Protestant Reformation divided Western Christianity and undermined papal authority to proclaim crusades, while the rise of strong national monarchies created new focuses for loyalty and identity. The wars of religion within Europe made the concept of Christian unity against external enemies increasingly obsolete. The scholarly rediscovery of the Crusades during the Romantic period created new interpretations of the movement that emphasized its cultural and literary significance, rather than its religious or political dimensions. Writers like Sir Walter Scott and historians like Joseph Michaud portrayed the Crusades as epic adventures that embodied medieval chivalry and spiritual idealism. These romanticized interpretations, while historically questionable, influenced popular understanding of the movement for generations. The colonial period saw various attempts to revive crusading imagery and rhetoric in the context of European expansion into Muslim territories. The French conquest of Algeria was sometimes portrayed as a new crusade, while British imperial ventures in the Middle East drew on crusading precedents. These comparisons, while politically motivated, revealed the enduring power of crusading symbolism in European culture. The creation of modern Israel and the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East have given new relevance to crusading history and its contemporary interpretations. Both supporters and critics of various political positions have drawn on crusading precedents to support their arguments, often with limited historical accuracy, but considerable emotional impact. The persistence of crusading imagery in contemporary discourse demonstrates the movement's continued symbolic significance. The development of interfaith dialogue in the 20th and 21st centuries has prompted new approaches to crusading history that emphasize mutual understanding rather than conflict. Scholars from Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions have collaborated to develop more balanced interpretations of the movement that acknowledge its complexity and avoid simple moral judgments. These efforts reflect growing recognition that historical understanding requires multiple perspectives and careful attention to cultural context. The archaeological preservation of Crusader sites has become an international concern, as these locations represent important cultural heritage for multiple religious and ethnic communities. The restoration of buildings like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem requires cooperation between different Christian communities, while the preservation of Crusader castles in Syria and Lebanon has been complicated by ongoing political conflicts. These preservation efforts demonstrate the contemporary relevance of Crusader heritage and the challenges of maintaining cultural sites in politically unstable regions. The study of Crusader numismatics has revealed important information about the economic and political development of the Crusader states. The coins minted in Jerusalem, Antioch, and other Crusader territories demonstrate the complex cultural synthesis that developed in these frontier societies. The evolution of Crusader coinage, from initial imitations of Byzantine and Islamic models to distinctive local styles, reflects the gradual development of independent political and cultural identities. The influence of crusading experience on the development of European military orders extended far beyond the Holy Land. Orders like the Knights of Santiago in Spain, the Sword Brothers in Livonia, and various charitable organizations throughout Europe drew on crusading precedents while adapting to local conditions. The institutional innovations developed by these orders influenced the evolution of European religious and military institutions for centuries. The literary tradition that emerged from crusading experience continued to influence European culture long after the movement's military phase had ended. The Matter of France, the Arthurian romances, and other medieval literary cycles incorporated crusading themes and ideals, creating a body of literature that shaped European concepts of heroism, chivalry, and religious duty. These literary works often presented idealized versions of crusading that bore little resemblance to historical reality, but exercised profound influence on subsequent cultural development. The musical tradition associated with the Crusades, including the songs of the troubadours and the development of liturgical music celebrating crusading victories, created new forms of artistic expression that reflected the movement's cultural impact. The survival of manuscripts containing crusading songs and liturgical compositions provides insight into the popular culture of the medieval period and the ways in which religious and military themes were integrated into artistic expression. The final saga of the Crusades extends beyond their military conclusion to encompass their lasting impact on world civilization. The movement's influence on the development of international law, particularly concepts of just war and the treatment of prisoners, continues to shape contemporary discussions of military ethics. The Crusades' role in promoting cultural exchange, despite their violent character, contributed to the transmission of knowledge and technology that advanced human understanding in multiple fields. The transformation of crusading ideals into secular concepts of national mission and cultural superiority influenced the development of European imperialism and colonialism. While the direct connection between medieval crusades and modern imperialism should not be overstated, the intellectual and cultural framework developed during the crusading period provided precedents for later European expansion. The concept of spreading civilization and true religion through military conquest, while not unique to Christianity, was given particular form and legitimacy through crusading theory and practice. The enduring fascination with crusading history in popular culture, from medieval romances to contemporary films and novels, demonstrates the movement's continued relevance to human understanding of conflict, faith, and cultural identity. The persistence of crusading imagery in art, literature, and political discourse reveals fundamental questions about the relationship between religion and violence, the nature of holy war, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different cultures and faiths. As you rest in the deepest peace of night, the story of the Crusades reaches its natural conclusion not with the fall of Acre in 1291, but with the recognition that this medieval movement continues to influence contemporary understanding of faith, war, and the complex relationships between different civilizations. The Crusades, neither simply noble nor merely destructive, represent a chapter in human history that illuminates both the highest aspirations and the darkest impulses of religious faith when combined with political power and military force. The legacy of the Crusades lives on in the architectural monuments they left behind, in the cultural exchanges they promoted, in the literary traditions they inspired, and in the ongoing dialogue between Christian and Islamic civilizations that their encounter initiated. Their story, complex and multifaceted, continues to offer lessons about the challenges and possibilities of human cooperation across religious and cultural boundaries, the dangers of religious extremism, and the enduring human quest for meaning and purpose in an uncertain world. The medieval cry of Deus Vult has echoed through the centuries, transformed and reinterpreted by successive generations seeking to understand the relationship between divine will and human action. Yet as you drift deeper into the embrace of peaceful sleep, the story of the Crusades reveals layers of meaning that extend far beyond their immediate military and political consequences, weaving through the fabric of human civilization like threads in an ancient tapestry. The philosophical implications of the crusading movement continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of just war theory and the proper relationship between religious conviction and political action. Medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas drew upon crusading experience to develop sophisticated theories of justified violence, seeking to reconcile Christian teachings of peace and love with the apparent necessity of warfare in defense of faith and justice. These intellectual efforts created frameworks for moral reasoning that continue to influence ethical thought centuries later. The development of international law during the medieval period was profoundly shaped by crusading practice and the need to regulate conduct between different religious and cultural communities. The concepts of diplomatic immunity, the treatment of prisoners of war, and the protection of non-combatants all evolved partly in response to the challenges posed by Christian-Muslim conflict. Treaties negotiated between Crusader leaders and Muslim rulers established precedents for international agreements that transcended religious boundaries. The economic networks established during the crusading period created lasting connections between European and Middle Eastern markets that survived the movement's military collapse. The commercial privileges granted to Italian maritime republics in Crusader ports continued under Muslim rule, demonstrating how economic relationships could transcend political and religious divisions. These trading connections facilitated not only the exchange of goods, but also the transmission of knowledge, technology, and cultural practices between different civilizations. The agricultural innovations introduced to Europe through contact with Middle Eastern farming techniques represented one of the Crusades' most enduring practical legacies. New crops, irrigation methods, and agricultural tools, brought back by returning Crusaders, contributed to the agricultural revolution that supported Europe's population growth during the High Middle Ages. The introduction of sugar cultivation, improved textile production methods, and advanced metalworking techniques all trace their European origins, partly to crusading contact with more sophisticated Middle Eastern economies. The medical knowledge gained through crusading experience revolutionized European understanding of health and disease. The establishment of hospitals by the military orders, particularly the Hospitallers, created new models for medical care that combined religious charity with practical treatment. The exposure to Islamic medical texts and practices through conquest and cultural exchange brought European physicians into contact with the most advanced medical knowledge of the medieval world. The linguistic legacy of the Crusades enriched European languages with thousands of new words derived from Arabic, Turkish, and other Middle Eastern languages. Terms related to trade, warfare, science, and daily life entered European vocabularies through crusading contact, demonstrating the depth of cultural exchange that occurred despite the movement's violent character. These linguistic borrowings continued to multiply long after the Crusades ended, as scholarly and commercial relationships maintained channels for cultural transmission. The cartographic revolution that transformed European understanding of world geography was significantly advanced by crusading exploration and conquest. The detailed maps created by Crusader administrators and military engineers provided Europeans with their first accurate depictions of Middle Eastern topography, while the travel accounts of Crusaders and pilgrims expanded geographical knowledge far beyond the immediate theatres of military action. This enhanced geographical understanding contributed to the later age of exploration and the expansion of European maritime trade. The institutional innovations developed by the military orders influenced the evolution of corporate structures throughout medieval Europe. The Templars' banking operations, which extended from London to Jerusalem, created new models for international finance that anticipated later commercial developments. The order's combination of religious vows with corporate efficiency provided precedents for other religious and secular organizations seeking to balance spiritual purposes with practical effectiveness. The role of pilgrimage in medieval religious life was fundamentally transformed by the crusading experience. The concept of armed pilgrimage, while controversial, created new categories of religious journey that combined spiritual seeking with military service. The infrastructure developed to support crusading expeditions, hostels, guides, supply networks, continued to serve peaceful pilgrims long after military expeditions ended, making travel to the Holy Land more accessible to ordinary Christians. The impact on European artistic and literary traditions extended far beyond the immediate crusading period, influencing cultural development for centuries. The Gothic architectural style, with its emphasis on height, light, and spiritual aspiration, drew inspiration partly from Crusader encounters with Islamic architecture and engineering techniques. The pointed arch, the flying buttress, and other innovations that characterize Gothic design reflected technological knowledge gained through cultural exchange in the Crusader states. The development of vernacular literature in European languages was significantly advanced by the need to communicate crusading ideals and experiences to popular audiences. The chanson de geste, while building on earlier traditions, reached new levels of sophistication and popularity through their treatment of crusading themes. These epic poems created narrative techniques and character types that influenced European literature for centuries, establishing patterns of heroic storytelling that continue to shape popular culture. The musical traditions associated with the Crusades contributed to the development of secular and religious musical forms throughout Europe. The songs of crusading troubadours and minnesingers created new models for combining music with narrative and emotional expression. The liturgical music composed to celebrate crusading victories and commemorate fallen crusaders enriched the repertoire of medieval church music and influenced the development of polyphonic composition. The educational impact of the Crusades on European intellectual life was both direct and indirect, as the movement created new needs for practical knowledge, while also facilitating access to Islamic scholarship. The establishment of schools and universities in the Crusader states provided Europeans with exposure to Islamic educational methods and curriculum. The translation of Arabic texts into Latin, often undertaken in Crusader territories or by scholars with crusading connections, made classical Greek philosophy and Islamic science available to European intellectuals. The development of military engineering and siege warfare was revolutionized by the technological exchange that occurred during the Crusades. The sophisticated fortification techniques employed in Crusader castles combined Western and Eastern traditions to create defensive systems of unprecedented strength and complexity. These innovations influenced castle design throughout Europe and contributed to the evolution of military architecture that would shape warfare for centuries. The social impact of the Crusades on European feudal society was profound and lasting, creating new opportunities for social mobility while also reinforcing existing hierarchies. The movement provided avenues for advancement for younger sons of noble families, skilled military engineers, and ambitious merchants seeking to profit from crusading expeditions. At the same time, the enormous costs of crusading often impoverished noble families and contributed to the gradual transformation of feudal relationships. The legal innovations developed in the Crusader states created new models for governing diverse populations under unified legal systems. The Assizes of Jerusalem, the legal code developed for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, attempted to balance the rights of different religious and ethnic communities while maintaining Christian political supremacy. These legal experiments influenced the development of legal pluralism and provided precedents for governing multi-ethnic societies. The diplomatic practices developed through Christian-Muslim interaction during the Crusades contributed to the evolution of international relations and the concept of sovereignty. The treaties negotiated between Crusader and Muslim leaders established principles for interstate relations that transcended religious differences. The development of diplomatic protocols, the use of ambassadors with defined privileges and protections, and the creation of mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution all advanced during this period of intensive cross-cultural contact. The impact on women's roles and opportunities, while often overlooked in traditional historical accounts, was significant and varied across different social levels. The Crusades created new contexts for female leadership, as noble women often assumed greater responsibilities during their husbands' absences. The establishment of female religious communities in the Crusader states provided new models for women's religious life, while the commercial opportunities created by crusading trade allowed some women to achieve unprecedented economic independence. The technological innovations promoted by military necessity during the Crusades had far-reaching civilian applications that transformed daily life throughout medieval Europe. Improvements in metallurgy, developed to create better weapons and armor, advanced agricultural tools and construction techniques, The enhanced understanding of engineering principles gained through siege warfare contributed to improvements in bridge construction, mill design, and other civil engineering projects. The preservation and transmission of classical knowledge through Islamic sources was significantly advanced by crusading contact with Middle Eastern intellectual traditions. The libraries of captured cities, the scholarly exchanges possible during periods of truce, and the long-term presence of European scholars in the Crusader states all contributed to the recovery of classical texts that had been lost in Western Europe. This intellectual exchange played a crucial role in the development of scholastic philosophy and the eventual emergence of Renaissance humanism. As you rest ever deeper in the night's gentle embrace, consider how the environmental impact of the Crusades shaped both European and Middle Eastern landscapes in ways that continue to influence these regions today. The deforestation required to build crusading fleets and siege engines altered Mediterranean ecosystems, while the agricultural changes introduced to support large military populations transformed local farming practices. The construction of new towns, fortifications, and religious buildings created urban centers that continued to grow long after their military purpose had ended. The demographic consequences of the Crusades created lasting changes in population distribution and ethnic composition throughout the regions they touched. The settlement of European populations in the Middle East, while ultimately temporary, created cultural mixing that influenced local traditions for generations. The return migration of Europeans with Middle Eastern wives, the movement of Eastern Christians to Europe, and the complex patterns of conversion and intermarriage all contributed to demographic changes that shaped medieval society. The psychological and spiritual impact of the crusading experience on participants and their communities created new forms of religious consciousness that influenced Christian piety for centuries. The concept of earning salvation through military service, while controversial, became deeply embedded in European Christian culture and influenced attitudes toward war, sacrifice, and divine favor. The devotional practices developed to support crusading expeditions, special prayers, fasting, and ritual preparations enriched medieval religious life and provided models for later spiritual movements. The development of historical consciousness and chronicle writing was significantly advanced by the need to record and interpret crusading events. The detailed accounts produced by participants like Fulcher of Chartres, William of Tyre, and Geoffrey of Villardouin established new standards for historical narrative and analysis. These chronicles, while often biased, provided models for historical writing that influenced European historiography for centuries and created literary traditions that shaped European understanding of their own past. The influence on European concepts of honor, chivalry, and noble conduct was perhaps one of the Crusades' most enduring cultural legacies. The idealized image of the Crusader knight, brave, devout, courteous, and protective of the weak, became a model for aristocratic behavior that transcended the movement's specific military objectives. These chivalric ideals, while often honored more in literature than in practice, provided frameworks for understanding noble duty and proper conduct that influenced European culture well into the modern period. The economic theories developed to justify and finance crusading expeditions contributed to the evolution of medieval commercial law and banking practices. The religious prohibitions against usury were modified to accommodate the financial needs of crusading, creating new forms of legitimate commercial transaction. The development of credit instruments, international banking, and commercial partnerships was significantly advanced by the practical requirements of financing and supplying military expeditions across vast distances. The administrative innovations required to organize and maintain crusading expeditions contributed to the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions throughout Europe. The need to coordinate military forces, manage supplies, and maintain communication across vast distances required new approaches to organization and record-keeping. These administrative developments influenced the evolution of royal bureaucracies and contributed to the gradual strengthening of monarchical authority throughout medieval Europe. The impact on European understanding of geography, climate, and natural history was revolutionary, as crusading expeditions exposed Europeans to environments and phenomena previously unknown to them. The detailed descriptions of Middle Eastern flora, fauna, and geological features provided by crusading chroniclers expanded European scientific knowledge and stimulated interest in natural philosophy. The practical experience gained in adapting to different climates and environmental conditions contributed to advances in medicine, agriculture, and engineering. The influence on European military tactics and organization extended far beyond the specific techniques employed in the Crusader states. The experience of fighting in different terrain, against unfamiliar enemies, and in coalition with diverse allies required tactical innovations that were later applied to European conflicts. The coordination of cavalry, infantry, and archery forces, the development of new siege techniques, and the creation of military supply systems all advanced during the crusading period and influenced the evolution of medieval warfare. The role of the Crusades in promoting European exploration and commercial expansion created precedents and institutions that would shape the later age of discovery. The commercial networks established by Italian maritime republics, the geographical knowledge gained through crusading expeditions, and the institutional models developed by military orders all contributed to the foundation for later European expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The intellectual exchanges promoted by crusading contact with Islamic civilization contributed to advances in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and other fields that were essential to the later scientific revolution. The transmission of Arabic numerals, algebraic techniques, and astronomical observations through crusading contact provided European scholars with tools and knowledge that were prerequisite for later scientific developments. The exposure to Islamic philosophical traditions, particularly the works of Averroes and Avicenna, enriched European intellectual life and contributed to the development of scholastic philosophy. The artistic and architectural influences of the Crusades continued to shape European culture long after the movement's military phase had ended. The decorative techniques, architectural innovations, and artistic themes introduced through contact with Islamic civilization enriched European art and contributed to the development of new aesthetic traditions. The synthesis of Eastern and Western artistic elements created in the Crusader states provided models for cultural fusion that influenced European art for centuries. The religious and theological impact of the Crusades on Christian thought was complex and lasting, creating new approaches to understanding divine will, human suffering, and the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The theological justifications developed for crusading warfare influenced Christian approaches to just war theory, the concept of martyrdom, and the understanding of divine providence. The practical challenges of governing diverse religious populations in the Crusader states contributed to developments in canon law and ecclesiastical administration. The linguistic and literary legacy of the Crusades extended beyond simple vocabulary, borrowing to include new forms of narrative, new themes for artistic exploration, and new models for understanding cultural difference. The travel literature, chronicle traditions, and vernacular poetry inspired by crusading experience created literary genres that continue to evolve long after the historical events they described. These literary traditions provided frameworks for understanding cultural encounter and religious difference that influenced European thought for centuries. The final saga of the Crusades thus encompasses not merely their military history, but their continuing influence on human civilization in all its aspects. The movement's legacy lives on in the institutions it created, the knowledge it transmitted, the artistic traditions it inspired, and the ongoing dialogue between civilizations that it both complicated and enriched. As you drift into the deepest peace of sleep, the story of the Crusades reveals itself not as a closed chapter of medieval history, but as a continuing influence on human understanding of faith, conflict, cooperation, and the complex relationships between different cultures and civilizations. The Crusades' ultimate meaning may lie in their demonstration that human societies, even when divided by profound religious and cultural differences, remain capable of learning from one another, of creating beauty amid destruction, and of finding common ground despite fundamental disagreements. Their story continues to offer lessons about the possibilities and limitations of human cooperation, the dangers of religious extremism, and the enduring human capacity for both sublime achievement and terrible error. In this complexity, in this mixture of darkness and light, the Crusades reveal themselves as profoundly human enterprises that continue to illuminate the challenges and opportunities facing contemporary civilization in its ongoing quest for understanding, justice, and peace.